Hey guys, welcome back for topic 5. We will be doing just a general overview of the US presidency. So just some basics about the executive branch. The executive branch is created under Article 2 of the US Constitution, and it creates the office of the president and the vice president and lays out the powers of each of those offices. And really, the role of the executive is to faithfully execute the laws of the United States. So their job and the job of the people that work for them are to make sure, more or less, that laws are followed and enforced throughout the country. Now, in order to be the president, the Constitution sets up some basic requirements. First, you have to be a natural born citizen, which means that you essentially have to be born with citizenship. You shouldn't have to go through that application process. So, for most of us, this just means we're born in the United States to US parents and become a natural born citizen. You can also be a natural born citizen if you're born in the United States. To immigrants, you can become a natural born citizen if you are born outside of the United States, but say on like US military ground, that sort of thing. You have to be 35 years old, which is super young. We haven't had a president that young. I think the youngest president has been, or the youngest presidents have been in their early 40s. So 35 years old to be the president and 14 years a resident of the United States. Now, those are just the basics, but I want you to think about some informal qualifications. Like, what are the things that we expect of a president, right? What are those things that we expect? Maybe it's level of education, political experience, those sorts of things. Try and identify some of those. All right, so then in terms of terms, I guess, the president, according to the US Constitution, has no, or when it was originally written, had no limit as to the number of terms that they could serve. That is eventually changed with the 22nd Amendment. But I kind of want to go over how that shift happened. So George Washington is our first president, and for lack of a better word, he sets a lot of precedents or expectations for that office. And George Washington willingly resigns after 2 terms as president. And that becomes the norm. That's what everyone after him does up until Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt only served 2 terms, but he ran for a 3rd term as a third-party candidate, the Bull Moose Party. He did not win. He actually played a spoiler role by splitting the Republican vote and giving the office to a Democrat. And then FDR comes along, and FDR is elected to 4 terms in office. He does die in office. He does not fulfill his full 4 terms. And so after FDR, we pass the 22nd Amendment, which we'll look at on the next slide as well, which sets the term limits for the office of the presidency. Now, they had discussed term limits at the Constitutional Convention. Their debate really centered around, do we give a 4-year term with an option for re-election, which is what we have today, or do we do like a single 6 or 7-year term without being able to run for re-election? So a couple executive branch amendments, these should be a review for you at this point, but Amendment 20 changes the date of inauguration day, moves it up to January 20th, and sets up the process for what happens if the president dies between election day and actually taking office. Amendment 22, as I was talking about, says that no president shall serve more than 2 terms or 10 years in office. Now, 2 terms is only 8 years. So the way that you spend 10 years in office is you have to be vice president that covers for somebody else for the last 2 years of their term or less. If you fill their term for more than 2 years, you would only be eligible to run for re-election one more time. And then we have the 25th Amendment, which is known as the JFK Amendment. And when JFK was assassinated, we realized that we didn't really have anything on the books that laid out this process for presidential succession. Like, we knew his vice president would take over, but then who fills the vice presidential seat? And how's that process happen? And so what this does is it explains, what do we do when a vacancy in the vice presidential office opens? And so what they decide is that the president may appoint a new vice president with consent of both houses of Congress. Also in this amendment, we set up a process for the president to temporarily hand over power. Say they go under general anesthesia or something like that, where there's a risk that they wouldn't wake up, they can inform Congress and they can temporarily give up their position. And the cabinet can do the same thing. So the cabinet could inform Congress that the president is unable to serve. For example, Ronald Reagan, his cabinet invoked the 25th Amendment when he was shot and in recovery. So I mentioned earlier that Article 2 sets out the office of the president as well as the vice president. But the vice president traditionally does not have a huge role in regards to their constitutional obligations. More or less, their only constitutional obligation is to be the president of the Senate, which they actually don't really do anymore. The only time they kind of act as the president of the Senate is when there's a tie, and they can cast a tie-breaking vote. More or less, their biggest constitutional obligation is to serve as a president in waiting. Like, we need someone there if something happens to the president. Now, the role of the vice president has changed over time. And I'll ask you about this on your quiz to kind of summarize this for me. But as time went on, like John Adams, he was one of our first vice presidents, says that he really doesn't have a role to play, right? But today, our vice presidents play a huge role in foreign policy. They take on different initiatives. So just like the first lady may decide that, hey, I'm passionate about bullying and I'm going to take that on as an initiative, the vice president may oversee healthcare policy or tax policy, right? Like, they'll take on something and they'll really work on that legislation and work with Congress on that. So today, the vice president is a much more seen figure, both in foreign policy and domestic policy, and they also travel on behalf of the White House, campaign with the president, all of those things. Now, one of the reasons that early vice presidents didn't have a ton of political responsibilities is because traditionally the way that the vice president was selected is second place. So you lost to Washington, then you became his vice president. You lost to Jefferson, you became his vice president. So you had a president and a vice president that most of the time were of different political parties. So today, that would be like President Trump is the president and Hillary Clinton is his vice president. Imagine how that would work, right? It would just be crazy. And so this has changed with the 12th Amendment, and it allows the president and the vice president to run on a ticket together. And that's one of the main reasons that they really pick up some political responsibilities, is because now they're kind of acting as a member of a team, more or less. So, like I said, official duties of the vice president in the Constitution are presiding over the Senate, serving as a president in waiting, and then the 25th Amendment gives them the power to decide whether or not a president is able to serve in their role. So when Reagan was shot, his vice president and his cabinet can inform Congress that he is unable to serve in that role. So very limited in terms of their constitutional responsibilities. Now, one of the most important decisions a presidential candidate makes today is, who do I choose as my vice president? And oftentimes the presidential candidate is going to select someone who balances their ticket. And what we mean by that is that the person that they chose should strengthen their chances of being elected. And selecting the appropriate running mate is an extremely complicated process that takes into account just hundreds of factors and characteristics. So we look at race, gender, ethnicity, age, political ideology, political or military experience, position on issues. All of those things are so important, right? When Trump selected Pence as his vice president, Trump did not have any political experience. It was something that concerned a lot of Republicans at the time in 2016. And so he selects Pence, who is Indiana governor, had been in politics for a number of years, right? And so if we have Pence on the ticket, maybe it helps Trump win the White House, right? Clinton, a female candidate, picks Kaine, a male candidate who is from a different part of the country than she is, right? Kaine is from Virginia, I believe, Clinton from New York. So the hope is whoever I pick is going to expand my voter base, right? Barack Obama and Joe Biden. Obama's a young black man. Biden, lots of experience in politics, older, white, right? They're demographically different, and the hope is that it expands their voter base. All right, so I have a couple scenarios here where I'm going to ask you to identify like which of these ways of balancing the ticket is this an example of. So in 1960, presidential candidate John F. Kennedy, a senator from Massachusetts, chose Lyndon Johnson, a southerner from Texas, as his running mate. Is this an example of balancing the ticket on geography, religion, age and experience, or political ideology? Another example, in 1980, presidential candidate Ronald Reagan, a conservative Republican, chose George H.W. Bush, a moderate Republican, to be his running mate. What is this an example of balancing the ticket on? And then we have the first ladies. So I'm going to ask you guys to summarize after doing the first lady Instagram activity. How has the role of the First Lady changed over time? So in the beginning, we really just look at the First Lady as, someone who is more or less the wife of the president, right? They're there for social functions, and they're really limited to informal, behind the scenes advice, right? Just like you would give your significant other advice. So in the Instagram activity, you'll look at some examples of early first ladies like Abigail Adams in the role that they serve in. Eventually, the role of the first lady does shift into a public, more involved role. Eleanor Roosevelt is an example of that, and you'll see in some of her Instagram screenshots that she travels on behalf of the president and frequently fills in for the president in times of needs. In the modern times, first ladies have not only filled in on behalf of the president, but they've been advocates for causes that they view as important. For Michelle Obama, that was school lunch, making kids healthy, right? And so they pick these sort of causes that they find important, and they deal with legislation of their own, trying to get things changed. So you'll learn a little bit more about that in that activity. And again, you'll be asked to summarize kind of how that role has changed over time. So in terms of presidential powers, we can divide most presidential powers into two categories: domestic affairs and foreign affairs. So domestic affairs are the issues that are relating to the country's internal matters. Tax, healthcare, education, those sorts of things. Foreign affairs is our relationship with other countries. Now, presidential power has generally increased over time. The president has taken on more responsibility, been able to do more things through executive orders, and a lot of that is just due to efficiency. The problem is, what's the limit, right, on the growth of presidential power? And ultimately, that's up to the Supreme Court to decide whether or not the president should have that constitutional power. So in terms of their constitutional authority, they have what's called take care power. So they shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. In other words, it's the executive branch's job to enforce law. So Congress writes these broadly written laws, and they really leave it to the executive branch to figure out the fine print and make that law work in practice. And then there's a few different types of executive actions. So there's executive orders, which I mentioned a couple of slides ago here. And these are orders issued by the president that more or less carry the force of law. The only way that they're different than law is that they're not as permanent. The next president who comes in can decide not to enforce the former president's executive orders. Some examples of executive orders include FDR's internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. That was not a congressional decision. Clinton had a policy called Don't Ask, Don't Tell that basically said if you are LGBT and in the military, no commanding officer is going to ask you if you're LGBT, and you shouldn't tell anyone if you're LGBT. So that's both of those things are really significant policy that the presidents were able to carry out without Congress having any say in those decisions. The next type of executive action is an executive agreement. So this is an international agreement made by the president that really acts like a treaty. A treaty is a congressional responsibility. The president can more or less do the same thing with an executive agreement. It does not require Senate approval. Oftentimes, the executive will use executive agreements to make trade deals with other countries. So I've included some examples of that right here. NAFTA, and then the renegotiated North American Trade Agreement that President Trump renegotiated. That would be another example of an executive agreement. President Trump signed 90 executive actions in his first 100 days, which was historically more than a lot of former presidents, really with the exception of FDR. FDR signed a ton of executive actions during his time in office. Granted, he was also there for 4 years, but still, if we break it down by how many he did per term, fairly significant. And then the last thing is executive privilege, which says that the president or the executive can withhold certain information from the public and the courts and Congress if it is for a security interest. So keeping the country safe, right? Like imagine if President Obama had told Congress, or anyone for that matter, through a memo that he was planning on running an operation that would kill Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden's intel might get a hold of that, right? So that's a national security issue. The president could hold on to that information. However, presidents have used it to try and cover up scandal. Nixon tried to claim executive privilege when the Supreme Court asked him to turn over the Watergate tapes, which obviously ultimately incriminated him. Clinton also refused to turn over evidence of an alleged affair with Monica Lewinsky, and the court ultimately rules against him, and he has to turn over a dress that had some presidential DNA on it. Now, a president really cannot hope to succeed without loyal people who support him in his administration. So this could be congressional support. It could also be just support of a president's, like the people below him, his cabinet officials, his department heads, those sort of things. So for that reason, the president has the constitutional power to name most top-ranking officials in the federal government. That includes diplomats to foreign nations, cabinet members and their top aides, the heads of independent agencies, all federal judges, U.S. attorneys, officers in the armed forces. So the president can nominate all of these people, though the Senate does need to approve of them. We saw that play out just a couple weeks ago here when the president nominated another Supreme Court justice. The president also has pardon power. So this is more or less the power of forgiveness. And so the president can release someone from punishment or legal consequences for a crime. So they often do this because they don't agree with the courts. This is kind of a check on the courts. They might not necessarily agree with the law, the reason the person was incriminated, that sort of thing. One of the most notable pardons, though, is President Gerald Ford gave Nixon a pardon for all of his offenses against the United States in the Watergate scandal. Without that pardon, Nixon likely would have served time in prison for his involvement in that scandal. They do not have the power to pardon in the case of impeachment. And impeachment is when you bring a formal charge against a public official. The House of Representatives has the power to impeach. The Senate is going to be the group that actually gets to say, hey, you lose your job, and they confirm impeachment more or less. We'll talk more about that when we go back to topic 4 and talk about Congress. Now, these powers of clemency or forgiveness can only be used in cases involving federal offenses. So, if someone violated state law, it would be the governor's responsibility to grant a pardon if they saw fit. A president can also grant amnesty, which is a blanket pardon. For example, Jimmy Carter in 1977 granted amnesty to all those people who evaded the draft during Vietnam, which is a federal offense to evade the draft. But Carter recognized that there were viable reasons that people were doing that, and so he grants a pardon to all of them. Now, when it comes to a bill, how a bill becomes law, what is the role of the president? So presidents, in order for a bill to become a law, once Congress approves a bill, it goes to the president's desk and they have a couple of different options. They can sign that bill, make it law, fairly straightforward, or they can issue some different types of vetoes, which is essentially saying no to a bill passed by the legislature. There used to be something called the line item veto, which basically said the president could take this bill from Congress and say, I like all of this except subsection B. I'm going to cross out subsection B. The Supreme Court found that to be an unconstitutional use of presidential powers. They said with laws, you have to take it or leave it. So if you don't like one part of it, you have to veto the whole law. So line item vetoes were kind of a formal practice up until the 90s when the Supreme Court finds that unconstitutional. And so what presidents do now is sometimes they issue what's called a signing statement. So they can sign the bill, make it law as is. They can veto the bill, say no to it, goes back to Congress. Or they could issue a signing statement, which a signing statement basically says, I'm going to sign this into law, but I'm going to attach a message that kind of says how I feel about it, how I plan to enforce it. So the example I have of this is John McCain and a number of Congress people in the early 2000s worked on an act called the McCain Detainee Treatment Act. And in that act, they said, Congress said, that America is not going to torture our detainees at Guantanamo Bay, where we keep a lot of our like potential terrorists and people that have made threats against the United States. But John McCain and a number of congressmen felt that the way that we were treating some of these detainees was terrible, was unconstitutional, so on and so forth. And so keep in mind, this is after 9/11, right? So George W. Bush is president and he signs this bill into law because, like, we don't want the rest of the world to think that we're totally like torturing people. But we're also just past 9/11 and we're really concerned about terrorist activities. And so what George Bush does is he signs this into law, but then he says in his signing statement, the executive branch shall act in a manner that they use their constitutional authority of the president to protect the American people from further terrorist attacks. So I'm going to sign it into law, but I'm also going to say we're going to have to do what we can do to protect America from future terrorist attacks. Some of these tactics that are used at Guantanamo Bay, like waterboarding, continue even after this act is signed into law, when hypothetically this act should have outlawed those sorts of treatments. So that's kind of an overview of the presidency and their powers. Let me know if you have questions. Sort of a long lecture, so I apologize. But that's all of our notes for topic 5. So have a great rest of your day.